let's look at something really simple that we can do inside of Solaris to really speed up our workflows and also start to take advantage of some of the really cool procedural stuff that we get with USD and Solaris. So essentially what I'm going to be doing here is creating a base scene, or a scene that has all of the stuff in it that we would normally put into our scene. Things like render settings, maybe lights, camera, your base materials if you want. And then you can also do this with a recipe if you wanted to, but you get a lot of different nodes with that. So that kind of muddies up your scene in the stage context. So what we're going to be doing is baking this all down to a USD file and loading that in with a sublayer, which is just going to be one node. And we're also going to look at some really cool stuff that we can do with materials. So let's go ahead and drop down a primitive node. And one of the things that I do, or have in all of my scenes, is have a geo primitive. So that's where I store all of my geometry. So we'll create a primitive called geo. I'm going to set this to be a component, and we have that in our scene. Now, if I go ahead and drop in, like, let's say a SOP create, I can dive inside and let's just create some geometry here. Let's create a box. Let's drop down a match size and just make sure that's sitting on the ground plane. Let's drop down a grid and let's just scale this up, be like 30 by 30. And let's drop down a name node now. And what I typically do here, like I said, is do a /geo, and we'll do / whatever the name you want. And that's going to create that primitive for us if we were not already having that in our scene. So for this other one, let's call this one box, and then we can just merge those together. So once we do that, if we look at our SOP create here, we have those. We have this geo primitive that has those in our scene. Now, if I wire this primitive into this SOP create, you can see that nothing really changes except for those are just being placed in that same exact spot, which is kind of what we're looking for here. But I'm going to just disconnect that. Let's take that primitive and let's do a material library. Now you can also create another one that's going to house your materials, or you can just drop down a material library, do a Karma material builder. It's one of the first things that I do in any of my scenes is just create a base gray material. You can see that over in our scene graph tree, we have a new materials primitive with our material underneath it. So let's dive inside here and let's go ahead and set this specular roughness just up a little bit, because I use that to start to check, lighting and the form of what's in my scene. So let's go ahead and create a camera here as well. Now I typically have a focal length of like 75, so we'll leave that as is. And then we can even put in a couple of lights. So let's wire our geo back in here. Let's disconnect that there, and let's create a couple of area lights. Let's do maybe one here, and we'll put another one over here. So you could essentially do this with a bunch of different lighting setups if you wanted, and just sublayer them all into your scene as well. It's something that you can 100% do. But let's drop down our Karma setup after this. Go ahead and close that and drag this out of the way. So let's go ahead and call this Karma underscore, let's do XPU, and then render settings. And I'm going to set the resolution to be just 1920 by 1080 because that's what I typically render out to. And then we can do our Karma XPU. And everything's essentially set up at this point. So we just need to drop down a USD ROP, and then we can just write this to disk. Now we're going to do some cool stuff with our materials here in a moment. But for now, let's just write this to a scenes, and then we'll call this default underscore scene USD. Then we can save that to disk. And actually what I just did is write all of this to disk, which includes this geometry. I don't want that. So let's go ahead and just disconnect that, save that to disk one more time, and then we can sublayer this back in. So if I come to the sublayer, let's load that file. And if we look here at the sublayer, we have all of the stuff that we had already created. So I can wire in this SOP create down after this. And you can see that we essentially have the same thing that we had over here. So we have our geo, we have our render settings, we have our different lights here. And I can go ahead and start to render. And this is going to just give us, what we had set up based off of our render settings, which is super cool. Let's go ahead and press D, and I'm going to just get rid of that grid for the moment. Now, if we want to, let's say, move the camera around, if we just set our camera here, we can start to move this around and frame up our shot. It's going to create that edit camera for us, so we don't have to do anything there. If we want to edit any of our lights, let's do an edit, light edit. And then we can just drag in whatever light we want for our primitives. And let's say I want to change the exposure. Let's go to set or create there, and let's maybe crank this up. You can see this is affecting our scene. I can start to render and play with this, and it's going to change accordingly. Now, if I wanted to change, let's say, our render settings, all we have to do for that is drop down a render settings edit. Let's come in and make sure we set our render settings primitive here. Come into Karma, and let's say maybe we want to turn on our denoiser. Come down to image. We can do image filters. Let's set or create. We can use the optics denoiser. Let's go ahead and load up XPU, and you can see that that's going to change that. If I wanted to just increase our samples per se, I can set this to like 512. Now it's going to render for a little bit longer, and then our denoiser is going to kick in, and you see that we're all set there. So we can still change all of our settings like we would before, but it's just, I guess, a little bit different of a layout here. But what makes this really cool is our materials. So let's take a look at those one more time. Let's jump back in here, and let's make another one. Let's do a Karma material builder. And let's call this one, like, I don't know, base, material X, standard surface. And what is awesome about this is we can now come into this standard surface. And let's say we wanted to, set this all up so that we have all of these parameters exposed. I can come in here and I can just middle click on these. I can click this send future errors to the console, and then I can click this promote subnet input. And what that's going to do is just give us that on our actual subnet in here. And we could come in here and we can start to, let's say, I'm not going to do it with all of them, but let's say we wanted to build out a material that has our, material X tiled images. We can wire this into our base color here, and then I can do the same thing with this file. I can click on this and we call this base underscore color. And then we'll give it a nice label of base color as well. And then this is basically, set up for us to wire in something for our base color here. And let's go ahead. I'm just going to up the roughness a little bit here because we'll load in something. But once I've done this, I can come back into our our USD ROP. I can click save to disk. And actually, before I do that, let's say we want to edit this user interface like we would with a normal HDA and put these all inside of like a folder called, let's do a collapsible, called base color. We can do that. Let's actually put them in there. That would be helpful. And I can click accept here. Now we have this in here. And so once we go to this USD ROP and we click save to disk, we can now reload our file here. We have this material X standard surface in here now. We can drop down a material linker. And we can just go ahead and assign this. Let's do this base gray to our box. And then for the standard surface, we can drop in our ground plane there. And this is going to load this up. And because I don't have any files selected, it's not going to do anything. But how do we actually select our file here? So we don't have any option to do that in here. So if we use we can either do the edit material network, which if we load in this standard surface, we can click this author edits to an inherited material. And that's just going to create another material that's going to allow us to not make changes to like the one that we have selected. So once I click load here, we have this edit material down here. We can call this, I don't know, material X2. And once we dive inside here, you can see we have access to the entirety of the subnet here. So everything that we had loaded up in here, we still have access to change this however we want. Now, if we don't want to do it that way, we can also just do an edit material properties node. And what this is going to allow us to do is wire this in. If we set this to reference, we're going to have that same behavior where we get this material X2 or material X3. And we can click this create parameters. And now we have that parameter interface just on this node itself. And I can click this set or create, and I can come in and I can set this to, whatever we wanted to. Let's just drop down like a CopNet here real quick. And we'll do like a fractal noise. Just close off that error log. And then an output. Let's just call this noise, render to disk. So I can load up that for the base color. And let me just shake that out, and we'll do that on before the material linker so we can wire this in here. So instead of this standard surface, let's go ahead and do that material X3. Let's wire this into the ground. And if I go ahead and load up Karma XPU or CPU, we get that noise on our actual texture. So you can obviously build out your material. I've already done this with a material, with a whole scene, just that I've built myself. So I can show that real quick. Let's do another sublayer. I'll wire this into stop create here. And let me just pull this up. And I'm going to load in this one. And so what I have here, if I just, let me just get rid of all of that actually, because we're going to get a bunch of errors here. So frame up our camera again. So I've got a bunch of different things in here. So I've got my render settings. I've got a base gray material. Also got a base material like standard surface and one for the open PBR surface. So if I do that edit material properties, I can load in one of these, set this to reference, and we'll just call this like material X2. And then create parameters here. And I've got a full interface. So I've got everything that is broken out here. So everything that you would normally have on your material X standard surface node, I've promoted all those parameters. And I've also built out some of the typical things that you use. So things like our base color. So if I have this use base color map, I click that, we go from using this base color here. Let's go ahead and get a material linker. I'm going to assign that to the box. Let's do this base gray for the ground. You can see that this is already showing up in our viewport here. So if I go and set this back to do nothing, we're not going to have anything, but we can have that to that set or create. We can use a base color here, or I can check this use base color map, and it's automatically going to switch this over with our dynamic UI. So your dynamic UI that you have with your HDAs, that's going to maintain that in this interface, which is super cool. And I can click set or create here, and we can load in, let's say that noise texture that we had before. Load up our Karma XPU, and we have that just rendering like we would expect it to. And I've got some other things in here that have, our texture scale. So I've got the ability to control all of our individual textures that I would normally use. And I can always go back to this as well, and I can edit the whole material using that edit material network node. I can dive inside and load up that material and change it however I want. I can also go in and rebake this file down and just change, whatever I want. Let's say I didn't have a map that I typically use, or that I'm starting to use more, maybe something, I don't know, like something I left out or I made a mistake with that material when I was creating it. I can go back and I can edit that and I can rebake that USD file, and then everything's already going to be saved or set up, I guess, for this in a new scene here. So we can just create this for, whatever materials we want. So we can use a bunch of these edit material properties nodes and just create whatever materials that we need. Everything's already set up there. That way we don't have to go in and create a material library and just set up everything by default. Because, it takes time to drop down, the tiled image. And then you've got the image place 2D, or the place 2D node. You have to wire into your texture coordinates, and then you got to wire in your texture coordinates into that, and you got to wire all those up, and it takes some time to do all that and then set the file paths and everything. So this just speeds that up just a little bit. I think that is kind of basically what's happening with like the quick surface material. Probably if you were to dive inside, but if you were able to dive inside, I guess you can't. But essentially, we're doing the same thing with that. And it only takes a little bit to set up. It's not a super complex process. And then you can just, like I said, set this to reference, load in your material, and then you can create different ones based off of that. And it's super quick and easy to do. So I will put the file for that on Patreon, as well as my sublayer file that I loaded in here. If you're interested and you don't want to set this all up, you can download that off of there if you want. But if it's really not something that's super complex to do, so you can do it pretty quickly and easily with just a little bit of time. So set that up if you're interested, and you can set up, like I said, different lighting setups as well if you want to do that, and then you can just sublayer those in another sublayer node and test out different lighting setups super easily. That way you don't have to continue to reset those all up yourself in each of your scenes as well. So whatever you can do to set up your time or save yourself some time. You also do this with the material libraries as well. You can just save those to disk and sublayer those in as well. And you can have a bunch of, a material library set up, or if you wanted to use the new recipe that is in Houdini 21, I got a video on that, and you can set up your own, material database and everything super quickly and easily through that as well. Anyways, hopefully this has helped you out. Thank you guys for watching, and have a good day.